Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, and welcome to the Full Scottish on this, the 2nd of March. As regular viewers will know, this is Broadcasting Scotland's review of what's happened over the past 7 days, with a little look forward to what may happen in the coming week. Though after the tumultuous week we've had, it's a brave man who will predict what will happen next. But to attempt to unravel the week, I'm joined by two guests in the studio today. The first is Campbell Gemmell, a frequent contributor to Broadcasting Scotland. Campbell works in the area of environmental policy and regulation, often with and for the OECD. He's a visiting professor at Strathclyde and an honorary professor at Glasgow University. So welcome back, Campbell.
Thanks very much, Douglas. Good to see you.
Thank you. And on a joyous weekend for Wales, in that yesterday was St David's Day, and it wasn't marred by the fact that they had to watch their rugby team play, joined again by Hugh Marshall, the founder of Talking Wales. Welcome back to you also.
Thank you. Just remember that we're playing you next Saturday. So.
Oh yes, I'm very aware of that. So we begin today not with Ukraine for a change, because there's so much in Ukraine, and we moved it into a block in the middle of the program, and instead we start with Gaza. At least 48,388 Palestinians have been killed and 111,803 wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. The Phase 2 Gaza ceasefire talks have reached an impasse. Phase 1 has ended, and Israel has stopped the entry of all humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. So just to remind viewers, the Phase 1 ceasefire ended on Saturday, and the United States envoy to the Middle East has asked for an extension of the ceasefire through Ramadan and Passover. Hamas has not been happy with that for the extension, and Israel has said if they don't agree to the extension, the war may restart, and for the time being they have blocked all humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Phase 2 of the peace talks, of the ceasefire, were to involve the return of all other living hostages to Israel and the removal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip. So I'm curious, what do you think, Campbell? Is this just a glitch in negotiations, as there always are in peace talks, or is Netanyahu just not serious about removing troops from Gaza?
It's so hard to tell, isn't it? Because it feels like it's a series of steps and missteps and cat and mouse between the main players. I mean, it does seem to me that the balance that Netanyahu is working with his own coalition of parties, some of whom are considerably more extreme even than he is, requires a robustness in his approach that basically looks for fault and looks for difficulties in order that effectively they can pause and retain presence and control. In a way, given the context, it's perhaps surprising that things have gone, quotes, as well, quotes, as they have done so far, and that so many hostages and prisoners, etc., have been released. But we've been talking about this for such a long time, and it feels like it follows this jagged, awkward, painful trajectory for everybody involved, and given the change in administration in the US, that is constantly a factor in the whole process. So for me, I suppose fingers continue to be crossed, and hope continues as long as the process in some shape or form carries on. But this is the important bit. The next bit is the important bit in terms of the Israeli withdrawal, the way in which the UN and other forces can be involved in trying to hold a peace at the same time as the beginnings of proper aid presence and reconstruction can begin. But we don't have a model. We've got crazy stuff coming from the White House, and more of that anon. And we've got possibilities that are there for us to consider. But if aid can't get in, if reconstruction cannot begin with an agreed overall plan, it's very hard to see beyond, step and step at a time. As you said earlier, it's a brave person at the moment, given the week we've had, that would look forward confidently that there is a workable strategy. It feels like we're still stumbling, we're still moving forward, but only just. So I'm afraid, again, I don't have any greater wisdom to offer than that. It's one where there is some hope, but it almost allows us to forget just the incredible state of decay and harm that has been created over the last years. You have to start somewhere. So we should celebrate any small step in the right direction, but my goodness, what a difficult pair of partners, and then the ringside other players we have to observe. And we perhaps talk about aid from a UK perspective later on, but if aid is in any way reduced, this is a cause of serious concern, given the condition of the people in that part of the world.
Thank you. Hugh, the aid situation is such that there is a fair bit apparently in storage in Gaza at the moment, so it's not an immediate emergency. But Hamas spokesman said this morning the international community must apply pressure to the Israeli government to stop starving our people. Surely that's naive in the extreme, given the fact that no one in the international community has managed to put any pressure on Israel to achieve anything, and the United States does not really appear to be interested.
Yeah, and I think going back to what I was saying earlier, I was listening to a commentator from the Middle East on the radio this morning, who made the comment, which I thought was quite telling, that basically Netanyahu doesn't want the war to end, because if it does, he's going to face the consequences. He's going to be voted out, and he's going to be facing the courts in Israel without mention of any international courts. But it does make you feel, especially now that we know the United States is just basically withdrawing from the rest of the world, and the values-based sort of order that we had seems to be sort of disappearing. So there is more reliance on Europe as a group of countries, but also on the countries of the Middle East, because we do forget that Palestine is surrounded by some relatively wealthy countries who could be providing more support, and why that isn't happening, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, indeed, a perennial complaint of the Palestinians about the lack of help from the neighbours. But I suppose Jordan is terrified at the thought of having another 2 million displaced Palestinians coming into the country. So not a simple one to solve. We'll turn now to Ukraine and our normal Ukraine update on this day 1103 since the illegal invasion by Russia of the country. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is willing to restore dialogue with the US. French President Emmanuel Macron has said after speaking with the Ukrainian leader following the disastrous White House exchange with US President Donald Trump on Friday. Macron said the dialogue would include a deal that would give US access to revenues from Ukraine's natural resources. Macron also spoke to Trump, but did not reveal any details about the call. The White House had no immediate comment. Macron's comments came as President Zelenskyy arrived in London ahead of a summit of European leaders today, which will discuss a peace plan for the Russia-Ukraine war. Sir Keir Starmer will host European heads of government and the leaders of Canada and Turkey at the Special Defence Summit aimed at presenting a united front on Ukraine. Prior to the summit, Starmer told Zelenskyy he had, quote, full backing across the United Kingdom, and that we stand with you and Ukraine for as long as it may take. Zelenskyy said Kyiv would use a new £2.26 billion loan from the UK to manufacture weapons in Ukraine. President Zelenskyy is due to meet King Charles on Sunday. The official audience is to be held at the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. Turkey's foreign minister will reiterate at Sunday's meeting of European leaders an offer from Ankara to host peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, a Turkish diplomatic source has said. On Saturday, Ukrainian officials said that Russian strikes around Ukraine had killed 1 person and wounded 19. In the southern Odessa region, 1 died and 3 were injured, Ukrainian prosecutors said. The regional governor said a Russian missile struck port facilities in the city of Odessa, injuring 2 port workers and damaging infrastructure and the vessel. The Russian Defense Ministry has claimed to have seized 2 more villages in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces say they have captured Sudny and Berlatska in the south of the eastern Donetsk region on Saturday. A new monitoring mission from the UN nuclear watchdog arrived at the Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine on Saturday for the first time through Russian territory, the Moscow-installed head of the plant said. The International Atomic Energy Agency rotation came after weeks of delay caused by military activity around the site, with each side blaming the other for violating rules to ensure the team's safe passage to the plant. On Saturday, Russia said it had shot down 3 Ukrainian drones targeting a major gas pipeline carrying Russian supplies to Europe via Turkey, in the second such incident this year. The attack was aimed at the Ruskaya gas compressor station in the southern Krasnodar region, an element of the Turk Stream pipeline network, according to Moscow. Hundreds of people marched through central Berlin on Saturday alongside Yulia Navalny, the widow of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, to demand an end to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Navalny was at the head of the march alongside Russian opposition figures Ilya Yashin and Vladimir Kara-Murza. Alongside slogans denouncing Russian President Vladimir Putin and Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, some protesters also carried signs criticizing Donald Trump. Well, in a moment, we'll move on to the politics surrounding Ukraine, but there have been many reports of, I suppose it has been throughout the war, of Russia being almost at the point of economic collapse. And now it seems with Trump's intervention, they might be spared that. How credible do you think these reports are, Campbell? Is Russia almost at the end of? I mean, we see Russian infantry advancing on bikes, on hoverboards, on donkeys. Is Russia almost done, do you think, economically, financially?
Hard to tell. I mean, clearly there is support coming to them from China, from Iran, from North Korea. They're receiving support in a variety of interesting, probably not entirely explicit ways. And I tend to follow Steve Rosenberg and the observations and commentary he makes, often under, I imagine, fairly challenging circumstances from within Moscow. And he's expressed some surprise from time to time at the fact that this carries on, and clearly opposition exists across Russia and outside in the neighbouring countries. But somehow or other, Russia carries on. They've got deep reserves from what they always refer to as long, cold winters, meaning literal and metaphorical versions. So the resistance when opposition is not strong and cannot be strong to global views is such that I suspect Putin will carry on unless stopped, and that's the context in which we have to see all of the other political dimensions. But it is extraordinary. One of my former colleagues in Oxford is a serious long-term Russian expert, and she has been watching from a university position in Finland for a long time the way in which Russia has continued to survive and endure. They have phenomenal resources themselves, and they have still significant weaponry. But the way in which cannon fodder, to use that shorthand, the way in which Russian soldiers have been deployed, the mercenaries that have been engaged from North Korea, etc. It's an extraordinary campaign that he is waging, and it is remarkable that it has not been any more successful than it has been. And we've heard about new villages or old villages being captured once again, and there has been a trading back and forth between Ukraine and Russia during pretty much the whole length of the campaign so far. But this war, I would have thought for Putin has to end at some point. He simply thought it would end quicker and end more favourably. But with the change in the geopolitical alignment with the US, clearly a victory that he can sell internally is more likely. But with rampant inflation, with shortages of all kinds, with, for example, Canada, very interestingly, using more explicitly than some other countries frozen assets that came from Russia in support for Ukraine, and it seems also in weaponry and in training for the military. There is a continuing tension and change, perhaps, in balance behind the scenes. But given the difficulties of getting on the ground reporting in Russia, a bit like in the Middle East, it's hard to get really objective views. But I think they have to be seriously struggling. So I would imagine there is a real desire to get this done in some shape or form. And I imagine that's also why engaging American support matters so much to Putin.
Yeah, I'm sure. Campbell alluded there to the bit in the report about Russia claiming to have taken a couple of villages this week. The Ukrainian reports also said that they had retaken parts of Toretsk and had potentially encircled Russian troops there. So it is a backwards and forwards, and has been all the time. Can there be a military solution to this, Hugh? Can Ukraine win, or is it going to have to be a political settlement with compromises that they don't want to make?
It's a difficult one when you think about it. The imbalance. You've got Russia, a superpower with the resources that they have up against Ukraine. You would think that Russia would be able to sort of comfortably, win, but it's clear that they've underestimated Ukraine. They've underestimated the resolve of the rest of the world to support Ukraine. So, I think it does have to be, resolved at some point. What was interesting as well, we'll discuss Trump in a moment, but, when he was saying, hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainians, sort of being killed, when the reality is, I think there's 45,000 Ukrainians being killed, which is a significant number. But I think the number for Russia is around 300,000. So obviously, that there's nobody's winning this war, but it's a tense affair, and it's almost like I don't know, it's like a no-score draw at the moment. But we do need some sort of intervention to come to an end. But we forget this could finish tomorrow if Russia withdrew their troops. Russia is the aggressor here, and the fact that they're now being seen in some sort of parts of the world as sort of equal partners in that they have got a case against Ukraine or whatever, it just beggars belief. But it was interesting again, with I think Rachel Reeves released some funds, sort of the interest on frozen assets in a form of a loan to the Ukraine. But I think again, perversely, I think what's happening now, or what happened on Friday, is almost creating an opportunity for the EU and other countries beyond, because I think we've relied on the USA being, the main supplier of arms and weapons over the years. Well, clearly, that's not the case anymore. So, there's clearly now a need to sort of ramp up production and capabilities within EU countries and countries beyond the USA, rather than being reliant on them. And I think that's what's going to really harm the US, is when you think about the money that Ukraine did receive from the USA. I think it was like 100 billion, nothing near the 350 billion that Trump parrots on a regular basis. That 70% of that money was actually spent with US arms companies. So I think Trump is, he's playing a stupid game here. That it's going to potentially, this is going to harm them, and the EU and other countries, in the Commonwealth countries, need to sort of stand up and say, right, we can't rely on the US, and potentially, there is the risk of the US becoming an enemy of the EU and other countries.
Thank you. That leads us very nicely on to the next part, the politics of what's happening with Ukraine, and the meetings which were held in Washington with, first of all, President Macron visiting Trump, and then Sir Keir Starmer, and then, of course, the dreadful events with President Zelenskyy, which the BBC report of it started off very even-handedly, said, well, you could either look at it this way, you could look at it that way. But it's pretty clear that most of Britain and most of Europe has viewed it as an abominable attack on a wartime president sitting under the bust of Winston Churchill, being attacked by a draft-dodging president of the United States who tried to stop aid to Ukraine earlier in his career. So the question I have, Campbell, is we talk about the West, but is America still part of the West? Is it an ally still?
Certainly doesn't feel like it, does it? It's been an extraordinary week, real roller coaster, and I think the details of personal expressions and reactions are always quite interesting in these interviews. The kind of more or less off-camera views, and Macron, when he realised he was going to have to intervene to correct the president in their Oval Office session. He was very rolling his eyes. He was certainly expressing, a kind of a mirth combined with sheer disbelief at some of the things coming out of the president's mouth. The comms have gone down, but what surprises me probably most of all is that the BBC, a large part of the UK establishment, and quite a few others are trying to find ways to somehow or other placate the president. And I don't know if it's a sort of public school heritage or whatever, but there's clearly some resistance to things like telling the truth and challenging people that are lying. And if you're happy endlessly letting the school bully steal your lunch money, then perhaps this is a politics that you want to understand. But the treatment, it seems to me, of Zelenskyy was an ambush. It was a bullying session with Vance implausibly in the room and talking complete nonsense. I thought it was very interesting that the Secretary of State was sort of sitting there looking like a scolded child, not saying anything, and then waited until after the meeting to say how outrageous it was that Zelenskyy was not more respectful of the US and the president. It just went so badly. It was like something that even Armando Iannucci couldn't possibly have written. It was just shocking. And I found myself, somewhere between outraged and disbelieving with each unfolding part of it. Now, in between, there was the Starmer event, and he was, for me, going into that sort of public schoolboy bit of the the style approach of being placatory and slightly jolly and slightly bromancy, but that's really what you want to do? Is that how you should treat Trump? Um, I'm afraid I've got, I suppose it's a regulatory history and attitude. I feel that these things should be called out and there needs to be a robust response. It has been very pleasing to see that a whole series of European nations, if we ignore the crazy individual in Hungary, there has been a very positive circling of the wagons by most of the Europeans. But we've also had the sort of the idiotic questions coming from the BBC of should Zelensky apologise? Well, apologise for being battered verbally by these horrible people. I agree with your introduction. I was just stunned by that, and the BBC cannot be allowed to carry on with that sort of appeasement line. It's just completely unacceptable. So I do hope that what's going on in darkest Norfolk over the weekend does result in a meaningful circling of the wagons. I certainly don't think Zelensky should be apologising, but I think the Europeans, having, in a sense, I suppose that's one point where I agree with Trump, having been free riders for a while, they do now actually have to put up. Because I don't think Trump is going to shut up for a while, and there is a need to spend significantly more and to do it relatively quickly so that armaments can actually be provided to strengthen the Ukrainian side of the bargaining table. But this is messy. This is weird. It is so surprising that we are in this place, and how to navigate out of it will require significant skill. And I'm all for the diplomacy behind the scenes, but I think leaders need to lead. And there are some signs of moving in the right direction, but they really do need to steel themselves to behave in a way that points out how unacceptable it is to have the US acting like this sort of a petulant version of a mafia boss is not what we need in a partnership across the Atlantic. We need our Atlanticism to be very strong on our side of it, and it'll be up to America to see what it really wants to do about that. But it's going to require a lot of rethinking, a lot of re-engineering of the way in which we, on this side, behave.
Yeah, thanks, Campbell. We'll pick up on your point about defence spending in a later story, but I'd like to go back to your point on being placatory to Trump with you, Hugh. And the amazing thing happened this week that the Mail on Sunday agreed with the SNP spokesman on foreign affairs, Stephen Gethin, in that the visit to the state visit of Trump to Britain should be cancelled, which has been echoed in many other places. It's not the most important thing for Ukraine, but it has symbolic value. And listening to American commentators, they feel that Trump sets a lot of store by it. So what's your thought on it?
Yeah, and I think, again, it was just incredible. And I think one of the other things a lot of people don't realise is that until about 3 years ago, Zelensky spoke very, very little English. So he's actually learnt English over the last 3 years. And, his English is very good. But, he was speaking to people in a second language. And I think, the fact that USA monoglot culture, they just don't understand that and take that as a factor. But as you say, Trump reminds me of the king in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. The sort of kind of person that you have to sort of give him gifts. You have to be nice to him. You have to massage his ego. And with Zelensky, he was there because his country is at war. And people are being killed. And I think the most telling part for me was not just the way that he spoke to Zelensky, but how he went on about Putin and the way that Russia had been treated, and blaming it on Hunter Biden coming from his laptop, from his bedroom and his bathroom. And it just showed just how unhinged Trump is and how thin-skinned he is. And that's the danger. And I think Starmer, I think there was an error there before they knew that Zelenskyy was going there, but the pulling the letter out, and look what I've got. I've got a letter from the king, and this is such an honor. Nobody's had this before, and you can see, just completely playing to Trump. And I think what's interesting today is the fact that the king has invited Zelenskyy not just to meet, but in Sandringham, and that is really going to wind up Trump. The fact that the first, sort of leader that the king meets is going to be Zelenskyy and not him. And I thought Stephen Flynn spoke excellently yesterday when he was making the point. And I think we do have to have principles. What do we tell our children? That yes, you just placate bullies. It's morally repugnant the way that he behaves, and the sooner we isolate him and just make him realise that he is on his own, the USA are on their own, and just leave them to it. Because that's what he wants, and he thinks that the world sort of revolves around him. And the sooner we grow a backbone and just saying, right, we're not reliant on them, we're cutting our sort of trade links as much as we can with them, and we're going to sort of be more self-sufficient and work more collaboratively with the EU. So again, there's an opportunity here, but I think that he's miscalculated it really badly, Trump, because even if you got people like the sort of Meloni in Italy, who you would see as a Trump ally, coming out strongly in favour of Zelenskyy. And even though Zelenskyy's popularity had fallen in the Ukraine, apparently since Friday his popularity has gone through the roof. So whatever Trump thought he was doing with JD Vance, it's just backfired spectacularly on them, because it's brought people out onto the streets in the USA as well, because there's a lot of Americans enraged. And remember, 250 million were eligible to vote. The turnout at the presidential election was 64%, and of those, just over half voted for Trump. So he doesn't have a huge mandate. Only a third of potential voters in the US actually supported him. So I think again, we need to look at that and just remember. I think the US, they've gone through a shockwave last month, but this is going to harm the US. It's going to harm them economically. It's harmed their standing. And Trump thinks that that his friends, who he says are Putin and Xi in China, it says a lot about the company that he keeps and considers to be friends.
Thank you both. A good point there about Trump's support. His figures have been falling in the last couple of weeks, and after calling Zelenskyy a dictator, if he could have the approval ratings that Zelenskyy had in Ukraine, I think he'd be very, very pleased with himself. But I said we would turn to defence spending. And this week, the UK government announced it would be increasing the defence budget to 2.5% of GDP, eventually going to 3% by 2030. But it's going to pay for it by cutting the international aid budget, which has already seen the one Labour minister resign. I mean, a couple of questions on this. First of all, cutting the international aid budget seems to be. I know what virtue signalling is. Is there such a thing as vice signalling? Because surely this didn't need to be done this way. Hugh already mentioned that Rachel Reeves had taken money from the National Wealth Fund, which previously was not allowed to be spent on defence and is now. So why could all the money for the defence spending not come from this, rather than saying, oh, what a good thing we're doing, cutting international aid? Second thing, is 2.5% enough, given that the state of the aircraft carrier, which was reported last week, and the fact that the RAF can't put one full squadron in the air? And is it, in terms of influence around the world, a huge mistake to cut the international aid budget? You can tackle one or all of those questions and your own thoughts, please, Campbell.
The two elements are so clearly intertwined, and I suppose we got the early signal from the US of US aid being effectively closed down. It affected one of my colleagues who lives in Scotland and works in Africa, and his contract was effectively terminated overnight. The way in which aid is seen as a kind of flip side in some people's head of defence spending is quite baffling, and I wonder what Robin Cook would have made of this were he still around. The need for soft power globally, I think, is incredibly important, and the way in which we spend our aid money from the UK, I think, has a long-term pedigree, and okay, it doesn't always secure alliances in the way that we might want, but it's a very important part, frankly, of the being in the moral high ground at least some of the time, of doing the right thing and helping to support nations that desperately and communities that desperately need it. Is the defence spending enough? Well, patently not if we are to secure our own defence, but then we would have to reverse also the idiotic approach of Brexit and actually stepping away from our actual main allies. And so the politics of the Atlantic, the politics of Europe, the UK going forward, are closely intertwined with this. Anneliese Dodds is a principled, quiet, sensible politician in my view, although I don't agree with her on everything, certainly not around Scotland. Ironically, but I think she waited until after the Trump event in order to step out. But she was absolutely right. This was a disgraceful step, and I think Rory Stewart called it a very stupid decision. And I also don't agree with him all the time, but I think he was absolutely spot on about that. We need to spend on both, and the amount of money that's actually spent on overseas aid, 12 billion in 2015, when we did actually just about reach the 0.7%, it's tiny by comparison with most other serious budget headings, and yet has a huge global multiplier effect in terms of its overall value. Defence, well, our procurement is hideously slow, hideously poor, and we've known that for several decades. So actually, the challenge of Ukraine and other global issues is enormous in terms of rearming or arming adequately and building things and getting them deployed. And you certainly can't do it in 1 or 2 years. So this is going to be really tough, which is why I think the European alliances are absolutely fundamentally important to the way forward. But yes, we need to spend more on both, and they both matter for the long term if Britain is to be even vaguely morally justifiable in the world as a second tier power. And I hope that they smarten up very quickly. But Reeves and Starmer following essentially right-wing thinking does not help with this. We again need to have a really good look in the mirror about what it is we're trying to do.
Thank you. That's a damning criticism when a glaciologist says something is moving too slowly. Hugh, the point Campbell made is it's a very small budget compared to other departments, 12 billion. Is this just a bit of political flag waving following Trump of yes, we can cut aid, rather than a serious financial argument that they're making?
Yeah, I think definitely that there's an element, again, Labour seem to be obsessed with trying to sort of, pardon the metaphor, parking their tanks on reform's lawn, because they know that, foreign aid is something, cutting that is something that plays well with that audience. Again, it comes down to education, it comes down to media to explain why foreign aid actually saves money in the long term. And can help the situation. From a personal point of view, I wish we weren't spending a single penny on arms and on defence. But the reality of the world is we have to. I think, as you said, the UK now is, it's a second-tier nation. It doesn't have the clout that it once had. It's not one of the sort of main players at the table. And I think one of the things that's interesting is, why is the UK still a nuclear power? When you think about the billions that are being spent on Trident, but if you are going to spend money on defence, why not spend that on more armed forces personnel and on more equipment and better equipment? I think we've got to look at how the defence budget is currently being spent. I think the war in between Russia and Ukraine has shown how much it's changed. Basically wars are now fought with drones. 5 years ago you would never have thought that. So the fact that the way that wars are being fought, there's far more sort of warfare going on in the digital space now. But especially after the US cut sort of the DEI, it's just incredible that the world needs more aid, and the fact that we're cutting it to spend on arms, it is the optics are just very strange.
Yes, thank you both again. A report by the Resolution Foundation this week found that child poverty in the UK is heading to a record high as 30% predicted, with only Scotland predicted to see a fall in child poverty. Now, the UK government seems to be committed to keeping the two-child cap and wants to implement social security cuts, yet the argument that get off benefits and into work doesn't really hold true in this area, where households with children in poverty, 7 out of 10 of them, one or both parents, is working. We see the difference in Scotland, particularly with the single child payment, which Professor Danny Dorling at Oxford called the single most important intervention and causing the greatest decrease in child poverty anywhere in Europe in the last 40 years. So the way to reduce child poverty is clear, but again, is this just, as you say, Hugh, parking the tanks on reform's lawn and purely ideological view? Hugh, I'll come to you first on this one.
Yeah, it's just really difficult, isn't it? Because they said that a week is a long time in politics. Well, it seems now that an hour. Just things are changing so rapidly. Just the way the world is almost turning on its head. Because I think there was an element with, especially with Trump, 2.0. That with the first bit of Trump, we knew, he was being controlled, by the people that were around him. This time, he's just come in all guns blazing, got Elon Musk in, and they've gone completely mad. You just cannot explain how, crazy. They're doing what I can't remember his name now, the guy in Argentina was doing, and it's insane. And I think it's not until and it will take a couple of months when people see the economic situation in the US. If that starts failing, and the likelihood is that it will, then you will get people on the streets. But as things stand now, I don't know where the world is going. It's baffling.
Thanks. Campbell, your view on the government's attitude to child poverty in the sixth wealthiest country in the world?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I have to say I give serious credit to the Scottish Government working at the margins of budget possibilities, that they have invested as well as they have in tackling child poverty. There have been petty criticisms of aspects of what they've done, but I think the latest budget highlights that there's an element of spread betting going on within the Scottish Government, of putting money into a variety of places that actually will have benefit towards child poverty agenda. The Resolution Foundation report that you mentioned is a very interesting report with lots of fascinating data in it, and looking at the recent trajectory across the nations of the UK, and then looking at the forward trajectory, highlights the way in which Scotland continues to diverge and actually diverges somewhat more in the forward 2 years than it has done already. So there is a very clear campaign of moving towards that. But it was also highlighted that there is a real problem with setting some of the numbers in relation to the two-child cap, simply because the UK government refuses to complete the negotiation and agreement around that, which is the Treasury dragging its feet. So, I mean, there is clearly a political agenda on a number of fronts from Westminster to make it as difficult for the Scottish Government actually to deliver on some of its policy objectives, even if it's simply delaying tactics and mucking about with the numbers. But the way in which the various policy tools are being used, whether it's school meals or health-based investments or social security, there are a whole series of things that are being continued, and all credit to the ministers involved for trying to keep that going. I think it's hard now to use terms like left and right because everything feels like it's been turned on its head. The right has captured most of the spectrum, but old left values in terms of communitarian assets and cooperative approaches still seem to survive within parts of the thinking of the Scottish Government in ways that Labour south of the border has completely abandoned. And Labour being silent essentially on the latest budget was helpful in terms of getting the budget through. But we don't actually know what Labour in Scotland thinks about tackling child poverty, because what they do is they carp about the details rather than actually saying whether or not they agree with the policy direction. And I think it would be very helpful if, again, a wee bit of political honesty and a grown-up approach to the fact that we used to be in a terrible state in terms of child poverty, and of course it should be eradicated within a civilised nation. But the fact that the UK government is happy to see it continue at a certain level, and we are in Scotland tackling it, is something that we need to take careful note of.
Yeah, you mentioned Labour's attitude, and there's huge surprise amongst people who are not Labour supporters that the Labour Party, the Labour government is taking this attitude. First of all, with aid, and you mentioned how different it would be in the days of Robin Cook, and now with child poverty. So we've seen the resignation of Annalisa Dawes, which you mentioned, Campbell. But do you think there's a well water ready to break the dam in Labour backbenches that will revolt against their government in Westminster?
Is that back to me, or
do you think it's?
Well, what I was going to just come back and say is, remember we've got the Labour government here in Wales. The Resolution Foundation report actually showed that child poverty is on schedule to increase here. So that's the reality. Is we've had 25 years of Labour in power, and there are more children in poverty, and that number is increasing. We got one of the wards, I think, where Reform won near Ebbw Vale last couple of weeks. It's 50% there. So 1 in 2 children you see on the street in parts of South Wales valleys are living in poverty. And this week we've had the Welsh Labour government publishing a load of videos saying, "Oh, look, this is what we've done. This is fantastic." The reality is people's lived lives are terrible. Poverty is a huge issue. And having having 1 in 3 children in poverty is bad enough. But the fact that figure is rising in Wales with the Labour government, it just beggars belief. And when it comes down to it, what can Scottish Labour say when their own counterparts are failing miserably in Wales?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wonder in Wales, and we always think of Wales as the home of Labour radicalism. Are the Labour members of the Senate just happy to go along with this? Or there was the question I was going to ask Campbell about Westminster. Is there a feeling that the dam will break in Wales and the Labour ordinary members of the Labour Party will say, no, this is not what we're about? Or are they just happy to be dragooned through the lobby?
Well, I'm
So
not sure
so
if you
for
realised that
Wales
was being pointed
specifically,
at.
Yeah, no, well, just before Campbell comes in, because it would be interesting to see, the Parliamentary Labour Party hates the Welsh Labour Party. There's no love lost there at all. They're at complete odds. Labour in Wales is far more, wants to be far more radical, far more sort of left wing. It wants more powers. It wants to do a lot of things. And we were told that having Labour at both ends of the M4, even though the M4 finishes nearer Carmarthen than it does near Cardiff, and that there would be a huge change. The reality is there hasn't been a huge change, and basically, trying to get Westminster to do things that Welsh government wanted to do is just as difficult with a Labour government than it is with a Conservative government. And when you've got a Labour government in Cardiff who can't get things, they want to have the devolution of the Crown Estate as it is in Scotland. It's not a priority, for say Labour in London, yet Labour in Wales want it to happen. There's so many things that they want to do in Wales, and they are being stopped. And I think that there is anger there growing, I think, with people within the Labour movement in Wales. We've seen people, leaving the party. People like Beth Winter, who was an excellent MP, from the traditional socialist side. She got deselected basically with the mergers of seats, and has now left the Labour Party. So they are losing these people, and they don't know how to respond to reform. They think that being tough on immigration and things like that, rather than actually improving people's lives, is going to make a difference. So it'd be interesting to see what the dynamic is between Scottish MSPs and Scottish MPs, whether that dynamic is different to Wales.
Well, we've certainly seen in Scotland the opinion polls suggesting a collapse in the Labour vote. So, do you think the dam is going to break in Scotland with a full scale Labour revolt, or are they just going to continue to say nothing, Campbell?
Yeah, it seems more like the latter than the former to me. I mean, there are one or two people like Monica Lennon that are clearly far more engaged with a whole range of social issues and as it were get it. But for the overall party under Sarwar, I mean, it's pretty clear that the spirits of Hardy and McLean and others are long gone. It's a party of right wing suits. And that's extremely disappointing, and even more alarmingly when you look at local media, etc., and listen locally, it feels much more like part of the Labour vote is actually going to reform. Believing tabloid nonsense about immigration and ticking just crazy lines that I simply, frankly, don't understand. So if Labour is actually going to change direction in any meaningful way within Scotland, it's going to require a change in grassroots approach, far better communication, far better leadership, and leadership, frankly, that doesn't come from badly run private business, but actually comes from people who understand other people and have some values that would be more acceptable on a kind of moral scale of doing the right thing for the majority of the people of Scotland.
Thank you. We've mentioned the Scottish budget, but this week the Scottish Parliament passed the 2025-26 Scottish budget, which included £21.7 billion for health and social care and more than £15 billion for local councils, alongside social security measures supporting an estimated 2 million people and £25 million to support Grangemouth. The budget was passed with cross-party support, with the Tories voting against and Scottish Labour abstaining, despite saying that they support many of the budget measures. It was clearly a very successful budget in that it gave most people what they said they wanted, that it united at least three parties in the Parliament, But John Swinney made more of it when he spoke about it earlier, saying that it was a challenge to democracy, and if it was rejected, it would be support for the extremists. Do you think he was right with that, Campbell? And what are your thoughts on that, on the budget itself?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Swinney's a seasoned campaigner and negotiator when it comes to these sorts of issues around budgets. He understands them extremely well, and I think the approach that was taken with his finance minister and deputy worked very well. I think it's disappointing, but hardly surprising that the two other parties played the political games that they played. But that we're used to that. But I think, in a sense, that former quasi-socialist zeal of making sure that people earning under 30,000 were better off, and that there were some incremental tax increases higher up, pretty modest ones, but actually liberating a significant amount of cash. Sorry, and the Scottish Fiscal Commission has said that Scotland, as a result of this, at the end of the budget process, is something like 800 million better off, and that has to be a pretty good situation to be in, and allows some of those investments in things that we were talking about earlier that help to tackle child poverty. Grangemouth's a bit wacky in that we're in a very, very strange position, not least because of drill baby drill, etc., coming from the US, and the delaying of what would have been considered green moves. So it's quite hard to know what to support for Grangemouth and how that will work over time. But clearly, certainly in my view, renewables continue to be a key part of what we need. And we've talked before on this programme about the need to address the grid and storage and various other issues. But I think overall, again, noting that the budget is severely constrained by the Westminster-based model, I think the Scottish budget has worked out really pretty well. We need to take a longer view to look at the directions that we might really want to go in, rather than what are not, it's tinkering sounds pejorative, but they're relatively small adjustments that are being made. But I think the adjustments are sensible ones. So I'm certainly very supportive of what's been done.
Thank you. And what does it look like from Wales, Hugh?
Yeah, well, our budget was passed last week as well. Obviously, because Labour require the support of at least one other member of another party. So the Lib Dems, they've got one Senate member. And she backed the budget, and in fairness, she got some good deals based along sort of Lib Dem lines. And I think one of the things, again, we do tend to bash Labour in Westminster, but at least they have made more funds available for Wales and Scotland, and that is something that that needs to be welcomed, and it is allowing both governments to spend on things that will improve, sort of people's lives. But it's not enough. The economic sort of shift that needs to happen from a Welsh perspective is huge. And at the moment, an extra couple of million is just papering over the cracks.
Yeah, thank you both. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We were £16,000 short of our funding requirements in 2024, which has left us short of the money we need to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We urgently need to raise at least £8,000 to pay our bills now. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. And please, donate whatever you can afford. So thank you first of all to my guests today, Campbell Gemmell and Hugh Marshall, for your contributions. And thank you to you at home or wherever you are for watching, whether it was live or on catch-up. Please join us during the week for our programming on Full Scottish with the Scotland at 7 news on every evening. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. From me, goodbye.